All right. So hey guys, hey everybody. Welcome to those of you that are tuning in right now and coming in. Welcome once again to my live YouTube show on Let's Only Be Positive. I have a special guest speaker here today with me, Kevin Brady. Hey Kevin, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for coming on and for doing this. Today we're going to be speaking on the subject of PTSD and anxiety, correct?
Yes.
Okay, very good. I know that a lot of people in life, they know that they have PTSD or they experience symptoms. They've been told by the doctors just because of whatever they've been through, whatever the trauma, whether if it's a veteran, experiencing war, memories of really poor upbringing, childhood, perhaps, something very traumatic happening. A lot of people have, they know that they have a PTSD, but they don't know what exactly it is, how it works, and they don't quite understand it. So today we're going to just want to talk about that, and I just want to ask you, can you tell me, the first question I want to ask you, what is PTSD?
Okay. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay.
The first thing I want to say is it's not actually a disorder. It's a natural human response to an unnatural situation that humans get into, which is trauma, right? So, and here's my trauma cat. Would like to say hello. But anyway, you may find yourself in any number of situations. Almost everyone has some kind of trauma in their life. Usually, people bounce right out and go on with their lives and take whatever they can from those situations. Sometimes, those situations are really overwhelming and can trap you or part of you back in that time period. That is the beginnings of PTSD. It can go, what normally has to happen is a later trigger event has to occur to bring that memory back into the present time and causes additional overwhelming problems in the present, which make it even harder to get through than the first time you experienced it. As we become adult, we have more and more tools of dealing with stress and trauma, so we normally can get through most of these things without any help. But sometimes things trap us more than others. And when that happens, you can develop what's called PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder has happened all throughout human history. There was the original Greek temples of Aesculapius, or however you pronounce it, but what they did was they had you remember what occurred and just keep reviewing it until you could leave the temple. And this was thousands of years ago.
Right.
This is a recommended treatment of the Stoics. Epictetus was a famous Stoic who recommended that people review things and gain from them over and over again. But the first person to do it in modern history was Sigmund Freud. And because Freud was not considered necessarily to be the best source for a lot of things, because he later shot himself in the foot with a lot of very unscientific theories, people have a bad taste in their mouth about Sigmund Freud. But early in his career, he focused almost entirely on what he called hysteria, but I think would now be called PTSD.
Right.
And what it was, he only pretty much dealt with the female children or the wives or debutantes, because men weren't allowed to talk about being distraught. It just wasn't considered right or possible. So whatever the reasons maybe why it wasn't treated, it was only treated in women, and it was called hysteria. And the idea was that women are weak and they might faint if something happens to them. So that was why the idea of it was hysteria. It's obviously not true. Men get PTSD, women get PTSD, children get PTSD, even animals get PTSD. This is not unique to humans. But what it is your brain has a part of it called the amygdala. The amygdala regulates fear and anger, and could be considered the stress part of your brain. It's the part of your brain that activates hormones to make you stronger, faster, make your blood flow to your extremities, and also makes you feel like you have to pee or poop. It's anxiety. It is anxiety. It feels like anxiety. You got to run. You got to run, or you got to fight, or you have to do something, and your body is getting ready to do extraordinary things. The problem is you get stuck in trying to do extraordinary things all the time, and your body starts pumping more adrenaline more of the time than it should. And over a long period of time, if you keep getting triggered, you keep getting these shots of adrenaline, and it's not good for your heart, and it's not good for any of your organs. You prematurely age. It causes all kinds of problems in the body as well as the mind. But what people mostly recognize, there is scientific research, if you want to look at that, to go into the physical effects on the body. More and more of it is showing up that people who have PTSD are much more prone to every other kind of illness you can imagine, including physical illnesses, but also mental illnesses, as well as much more likely to use drugs and go to jail or commit abuse on other people. So getting a handle on PTSD is very important. It's something every person should understand about themselves and about other people. Because if you can't handle it in yourself or in others, you're likely to perpetuate it and cause it in others. Whereas if you know how to do it, you can teach other people how not to have their symptoms of PTSD, and even actually to eliminate PTSD completely. And how to teach their children to be more resilient and their friends to be more resilient. So what I want to talk about with this is a little bit of the history of it, because what we know of it mostly comes from early Freudian stuff studying hysterical women, then some Jungian stuff where he tried different kinds of biofeedback with people on stressful words, or what he called complexes around those words. But there's also then been a lot of subsequent research during the World Wars, as multitudes of soldiers came home and tried to reassimilate back into the regular world, and found that they could not do so. A car backfired, they're jumping into a bush. Someone with vaguely Asian skin comes around and they become so troubled that they can't function at a social event. Yeah. There's any number of things that could happen from it, but it's much more pronounced with soldiers because the trauma is often much more pronounced, and there are so many of them that research could be conducted because there were so many people exhibiting similar symptoms from the same set of conditions. So that's the primary good research ground for any scientist. All right.
Okay.
One of the first. Go ahead. Do you have a question?
No. One of the things I want to ask is the thing is what you're saying is a lot of people, they don't understand the history, for instance, and they also even let's just say they know the history, but they don't quite have the tools in terms of being able to confront or address, or maybe it's too much for them to confront or look at it kind of thing, and they don't quite know how to deal with it. That's my thing is that, what if a person does know, they've read up all the history information in terms of what is PTSD and the underlyings of it, but don't quite have the ability to really deal with it, just because they just don't have the right tools, or they're not in the right communication with the right people, or if that makes sense.
It does. So I can get into that a little too. It really depends on what the symptoms are that a person is feeling. So they're very, what I would call idiosyncratic. And what I mean by that is every person has completely unique symptoms. They may be similar in that the adrenal gland has been shooting off extra adrenaline, and so they feel more anxious, more nervous. Those things are common. But where they acquired it largely determines how they're going to show it, right? So if you were in combat, it's likely that you will reenact some part of your combat experience. Maybe your volume of your voice gets louder or quieter, or you become more rigid, or you feel like you need to get lower to the ground. Maybe you crouch more. It really depends on where you acquire it. If a person acquired it as a child due to some form of abuse with parents or something like that, then they may revert to a childish nature. But it's totally idiosyncratic, which means it depends on how you acquired it. All right. So the commonality might be a feeling. You might have a very similar feeling to someone else, but because you acquired it in a different place, it may be shaded or colored in very different ways from a person who acquired it in combat, or say they had a very violent drug experience. It doesn't have to be physical violence. It can be any situation where your mind feels like, this is a key part of the definition in the old school. I don't know how it is. Now, the modern definitions in DSM are different than they were, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for desktop reference for physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and other helping professionals, okay? It's a labeling system that they use so that they can get the insurance companies to pay for a 50-minute hour to handle a symptom. But the signal symptom was fear that your life is in jeopardy. That has been broadened now to not just your life, but your physical safety, right? So if you feel like you might be attacked, that can cause you to go into adrenaline shock. You know, you can get massive adrenaline flow. You need to run and hide, or you need to fight. Or there are many different ways it can express itself, but those are the two primary ways. Or you might feel like you need to just lie down and submit, right?
Right.
So it used to be that it was considered that your life, you had to feel your life was in danger before they would tag you with PTSD, right? Now it's more general, so that if you felt like that person might threaten you in some way, you could still acquire PTSD that way. I've had discussions on lots of forums with veterans, and some veterans are very offended by the idea that a child who acquires PTSD from a fight on the playground could have every bit as bad symptoms as a person who acquires it in a combat environment. And usually that has something to do with, because it started out, or most recently was in people's public mind as combat stress, combat fatigue. PTSD comes from serious situations where you're being shot at, or you saw your friend get hurt, or killed, that sort of thing. So they feel that, you know, a person who acquired it in a different way, it should have a different name, because it's not the same as the serious thing that they're going through, right? And I don't mean to offend veterans. I am a veteran. I had a bit of PTSD when I came back from Mogadishu in Somalia in 1993. I was a classic case that I felt like I needed to dive into a shrubbery when I heard a car backfire. I didn't feel like going outside and confronting large groups of people. I could no longer go into a bar where there was a large group of people pressed together. Didn't feel safe, right? But it really doesn't matter where you acquire PTSD. Veterans may have acquired it in a situation that they feel they shouldn't have been in, and so they require some special recognition of their symptoms. And they should get special recognition of it. It's a very unusual place for a human being to be. But that doesn't mean that PTSD doesn't have general things that can be acquired outside of your life being threatened. Especially if you're a kid, if an adult threatens you in any way, even if it's with a loud voice, it can be extremely scary because you don't know what they're going to do. Especially if you've ever been hit before. You know, you don't know how far it's going to go. And as a child, you know, a person raising their voice to you, if you can't defend yourself, you're just every bit as threatened as someone who has an M16 when an incoming bomb is going off. You know, you don't know if you're going to survive. You don't know if what you can do can protect you. So you feel threatened. That's the important thing. It used to be your life was threatened. Now it's any part of you is threatened. Should be recognized as PTSD. Okay? There is an additional qualification of what's called complex PTSD, where instead of one major big problem that happened in some maybe combat environment, or trigger warning for those of you who may have experienced sexual violence, if you've experienced rape, those sorts of things can cause PTSD. Childhood abuse, whether it be sexual or just regular violence on the playground, someone screaming at you, any of these things could cause it. Car crashes, loss of a parent, anything that makes you feel your place in the world, your mind, or your body are threatened. Okay, does that help?
It does. It does. I can actually, relate to this too. And I'm gonna just real quick, if I may say this, Kevin. This is just, and also just a quick trigger warning. I'm gonna get a little bit into my personal, history in terms of my childhood. So just letting you know, for those of you that are tuning in, that are listening to this talk right now, this is just a trigger warning to let you know that I'm going to talk about my history, my childhood. When I was little, for instance, I was actually raised in an orphanage back in Russia. And one of the things I experienced on a regular basis was being physically abused. So the thing with that is, over the eventual period of time, I developed a habit that, because I felt so threatened and I felt so helpless in many ways, there's nothing you can do. I have this, adult standing over me, and there's really not much I can do other than to hold up my hands and to basically go like this. And so years later, when I came to the United States, I was actually was in a foster care for a while, and I remember very strictly, and I will never forget to say, and it was just such a weird thing for me. I remember just actually remembering, like, wow, what am I doing? I remember this foster family was talking to me, and all they were doing was simply expressing themselves, and they were going like this with their hands up to show their expression, and automatically I was in fear, thinking that I was going to get hit. So what did I do? I put my hands up right away, and they kind of stopped and looked at me like, what are you doing? Like, that's just like, and right there to them, they knew, like, yeah, obviously I've suffered a particular physical abuse where it really put me in a place where, because I was so helpless, it was a habit developed that I put my hands up. And that happened for a while until I started to break, through the fact of understanding this is not how it is anymore. This is not how life is anymore. It's changed. This is not like that. It's not going to happen again. So yeah, I can definitely, relate to what you're saying in terms of, feeling, helpless and just having that, just, you have no power. You just, as a kid, and you just really just go like, that's my, experience, with, just anxiety and PTSD and just developing particular habits by, putting my hands up to protect myself because I was feeling helpless. So does that make sense?
It does. And thank you for sharing that. It's a perfect example. All right. What I would say is, for anyone who's watching, what you need to understand is PTSD is not a lifelong sentence. This can get better. Even if it's persisted for an extremely long time, the mind doesn't work in a way where it loses the ability to fix this. It's sort of like if a computer has a virus. PTSD is very much like your mind has a virus, and the virus is an incomplete handling of what caused you to develop PTSD, right? So if you have your hands up and you're flinching, your mind generally flinches away from it too. It doesn't want to be there anymore, right? So it won't want you to go back there naturally. You'll have to force yourself to do it, right? So in order to resolve it, though, you need to go back there and process that experience. It's the only way I can call it. With virus handling, the process is complete removal. That's not really realistic with human beings. You don't lose a memory. It doesn't go away.
Right.
You can change the way it's filed, right? So with a person who has PTSD, that memory is kind of filed as something needs to be done with this yet. We're not done here yet, right? And then something triggers it later and brings it up to the surface, and the feelings and the emotions that come up may not be appropriate to the new circumstance that it's triggered in. And when that happens, it's called re-traumatization. Okay, triggering is the non-technical word for it. You get triggered. You change. Your physical affect changes. You might become overly emotional. Your posture might change. Your willingness to look people in the eye might change. You're no longer currently in the present moment.
Right.
Some part of you is going back to this past experience. And this is the case with anyone who has PTSD, no matter if they acquired it 2 days ago or 50 years ago. The mind still has that experience there, and it can still be found. With small children who don't have language skills, it's a little tricky just because they don't know what the words mean. So you have to get them to focus on the feelings, right? But that's more of a how do you handle it situation.
Right.
I have a therapeutic method that handles it, which is TIR. It's my practice. And it has a 72% success rate of removing people from the threshold where they would be qualified as having a diagnosis of PTSD. Uh, People are really careful in psychology about saying it cures it, but I'm not a psychologist, so I'll go ahead and say it. In about 72% of cases, it's just cured rather rapidly, usually within about 22 hours, right? More than that may be required for people who have complex cases, and some people it may never completely go away because they never get to the root incidents that are causing all the later sequences to get stuck, right? That's possible. It's very unlikely. If you have a good therapist, then you should be able to get to the bottom of it. But I wanted to also say that PTSD, people get really hung up in PTSD. There's a second thing which happens, which is called PTG, post-traumatic growth, right? And everyone pretty much has probably experienced that to some extent too, where you, I don't know, confront a bully on a playground yard, and rather than something awful happening, something good happens, and you were highly stressed out, you were worried about your safety, and maybe you do acquire one of these sorts of memories that needs to be processed later. But instead of coming out with a symptom or a problem, you come out feeling better about yourself. You realize what you do is you confront bullies on the playground right then, you get the teacher, you tell them it's not okay, whatever. You know, you do something positive and you acquire a positive thing from it. You feel better about yourself. You may value your life more than you did in the past. And this happens as a result of processing the incidents which cause PTSD too. So people might go into therapy feeling horrible and really wondering why they would want to go back to looking at those kinds of incidents. And the reason is because you can come out the other side not just as good as you were before, but feeling better than you were before. Are you there? Are you there? Are you there? Okay, I'm not hearing you anymore. Okay, so I'm not sure what happened on my end. I don't think I touched anything. All I saw was your "Let's Be Positive" logo come up, and since then I'm not hearing you. No. Let's see. I will continue. If you want to do questions by chat, I'll just refer by chat. Okay. Sorry about that. But so where was I? Oh, yeah, with the difference between PTSD and post-traumatic growth, right? It goes back to the therapeutic interventions used to be considered that it was just handling a disease. And one of the things we had talked about previously was that this is not actually a disease. The term mental illness is not really, it's a misnomer. Everyone knows what it means, so we'll probably stay with it as a society, but it's kind of a wrong term for what it is. You don't get a mental illness from a germ, you know. You acquire it from either, it's possible you could get something like this from genetics, although PTSD not so much. But there are some sets of symptoms that people get genetically. Others may be acquired through bad nutrition. Um, but there's lots of ways things can happen. The number one way I know of that people get what is commonly called mental illness now is through PTSD. Depression and anxiety are the most common ones I hear about that people want to deal with. And they're both symptoms of PTSD. So you can look at just about any number of symptoms and find a way that they could have come from trauma. So the first place I like to look is to ask a person, when did this start? If it starts at 25 and not at 5, then I want to know what happened at 25, what changed, you know? And if something big happened at 25, then you want to go over that with the person to help them process the thing which changed in their environment, or that happened to them, you know? So, okay, I heard you there.
Good.
Oh, now
Awesome.
you're back. Okay,
Awesome. Thanks.
good. So Yeah, I don't know if I was just wandering there, but I wanted to make that point that if someone has targeted you or labeled you with as having an illness, there's a reason for it, and it's usually not to do with your mental health. There are good doctors out there that only want to label you if you really, really, really have severe symptoms, and they want to only give you medication if the medication is required. But there's large groups of doctors that will medicate first, and maybe never do any therapy. And what I will say to that is, if you take aspirin to handle headaches from someone hitting you with a hammer, the headache may be mitigated afterwards. But if the guy hits you in the hammer again, you're going to have another headache. So you have to stop the guy from hitting you with a hammer. And in this case, it's the triggering of these traumatic memories. Okay? Once the traumatic memories have been examined and discharged of any emotional, stressful content, the hammer stops hitting you in the head. You might still have a headache for years to come. You know, this is not magic. It may sometimes feel like it because sometimes you get a sudden giant release from something that was painful.
Right.
But the reality is it could take a little while, and even after you have psychologically addressed it and felt much better and know where it came from, it may be a number of weeks, months, or years before your habits change, before you physically feel better, and before you get used to not being triggered, you know? So I just wanted to point that out as well. So I think I've covered most of my bases. Um, you have specific questions?
Yeah, can you hear me, by the way?
Yes, I can.
Okay, very good. The thing is this. My question to you actually, you know, you covered pretty good bases. Now, let's just say to those that, you know what, they want to address it, they want to actually like learn how to confront it or how to get rid of it or, lessen it to where they can actually function on a daily basis without, having so much stress in their hands, having so much anxiety on their hands, whatever that is. What would your recommendation be for them to like, just even if rather if it's their financial aspect that they can't afford to go see a good therapist, or if they just don't know, like they don't just have the tools. So what would your recommendation be for them?
Okay, the first thing I would say is therapy is a good thing for people who have a severe case.
Right.
You don't necessarily always need therapy, though. Sometimes people are very resilient, and if they are equipped with the tools to face things themselves, they often will, and they will spontaneously get better. You know, this happens as this is the old favorite line is, "Time is the best healer." You know, the
Right.
further you get away from it in time, the better you feel about it. If you change your environment, both in terms of time and space, you won't be quite as triggered as you were. So people who come back from a combat environment to the United States, it might be a bit of a shock at first, but over time, you realize I'm here, not there, and all of you starts to realize that, even the unconscious parts, and your life can get better over time. It would probably get better much faster if you had therapy, but uh, you know, time will heal it. Not completely, because it's really, you're putting yourself at a distance from something rather than addressing it directly. But if you are good at meditating, if you do yoga, um, if you do sports in general, increase your endorphin amount, and they make you feel better. So emotionally, you start to feel better, and they also make you feel more resilient, so that you're more capable of dealing with life now, even if you haven't addressed what caused the PTSD in the past. So what I would say is get therapy, but do other things too. Um, a therapist can help you address those specific moments, particularly if they're so hard that you can't address them with a friend or a colleague or a peer support group or a journal. Any number of things can help. But a therapist may be needed, and and very helpful, and I would recommend it, but it's not the only thing or the first thing that people should do. Self-care is much more important. A therapist will have a much easier time dealing with you and helping you if you are taking care of yourself, you know? So this can get complicated by lots of things. Like if a person has had a traumatic experience, which has left them feeling apathetic, unwilling to face the world, then they're very unlikely to start an exercise regimen. There's lots of things that can stop you from getting back on your own feet. In which case, I would say therapy, first and foremost, go get some help. You know, it's a critical thing in our world now because the U.S. has been involved in so many wars recently of such long duration that we
Yeah.
have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of soldiers coming back. All of them having some degree of PTSD, although it may not reach the threshold of a diagnosis for a pathological condition where they say you have PTSD, you know. But I've never met anyone who came back from a combat environment who, you know, they just kiss the ground and were like, hey, cool, everything's great. You know, it doesn't work that way. Usually it takes a little while of reassimilating back into the world. And this
Right.
is the same for a survivor of violent crime also. You know, it's like you don't wake up the next day and everything is fine. That's not the way it is. It takes a while to get better. And it takes a while to realize you're safe again. Therapy will help with that. Uh, Groups where you meet with people who have had similar experiences can help with that, although they can also be triggering, you know. So you kind of have to take the good with the bad with those. But it's good to have those associations with people who know where you're coming from, you know, because people who live in the U.S., especially if they've always had it fairly easy, you know, if they weren't poor and they always went to pretty good schools, and they never really had to face that much in terms of damage, they won't understand a person who really has faced very severe damage. They're very likely to say something like, you know, just shake it off, get back on your feet, you'll be okay. You're going to be all right. You know, stop with this. It's too much. You know. Whereas a person who has also experienced something very traumatic, they might be triggered by what you're saying, and so it may be hard for them to hear. But at least they have the common experience and can understand where you're coming from.
Right.
Um, what I really want to emphasize here is that there is growth that can happen from this. It doesn't have to be just a limiting experience, and therapy doesn't have to be just about taking away those limits. It can also be a growth experience. So put that in your pipe and smoke it, literally. You know, it's like, take that on board, because a term I've used before, maybe in one of our last talks, was eustress, right?
Yeah.
Eustress is positive stress, okay? Some people get really tough because of the things that they've gone through in their life. The toughness can have two parts. One part is they refuse to look at hard things, and that's not so good. The positive thing, though, is that they can face anything. You know, they've grown to a point where they can look at anything. They may not be able to handle it. They may have learned a technique to not handle it, but they can function even in devastating environments. So there is the possibility of growth to better than normal human capability and empathy, um, resilience, ability to face crisis. Once you have faced your triggers and they're no longer triggering you, you learn from them. And you become very valuable in situations where other people are traumatized because you have experience. You are now the person who can take charge and be capable, where other people are reduced to a shambles. So it is possible to have positive growth beyond the point where you were when you acquired the PTSD. And let me make a positive separation here also between the psychological condition of PTSD and a condition called traumatic brain injury. People often conflate them and think they're the same thing. A brain injury is not at all the same thing as PTSD, and they do happen. They happen from shock waves, from big blasts from bombs. They happen from hitting your head in a car. It can happen from playing football, repeated injuries to the head. Any number of things could cause a brain injury, and that's different than a psychological injury acquired probably while you got the brain injury. But the brain injury is separate. I don't know, I can't state that brain injuries will fix themselves or be fixed through therapeutic address of PTSD. It's a different thing entirely. It's like saying, I got a broken arm. If you handle the traumatic stress around the broken arm, you may not be worried about getting into the situation where you broke your arm in before, but that doesn't mean you don't need a cast. You still need a cast. And your arm might never work the way it did before, So it's important to make a difference between traumatic brain injury, which is TBI, and PTSD, which is a psychological condition. Okay.
Wow. That is so awesome. Go ahead.
I wanted to throw in our past talks where we've talked about trauma and communication. These things are heavily impacted by PTSD, right? So obviously, PTSD is caused by trauma, right? And it's actually a set of reactions to trauma that you're carrying with you that you haven't addressed. Whereas communication is impacted by PTSD in that you don't feel the same as you used to. You don't have the same reactions as you used to. And so people might have a hard time communicating with you because you've been through something that they haven't. It may be hard for you to talk about. It may be hard for them to hear.
Right.
So that's the trick is to do the work yourself so that you're capable of confronting it, because a lot of people in our society are not capable of hearing what you have to say. It's the biggest disservice we do is we talk about how we care about our veterans, we care about our violent crime survivors, rape survivors, abuse survivors, but none of us want to hear it. We don't want to hear their stories. We can't hear their stories. We can't understand them. And if we start to understand them, it hurts us. We feel hurt by it.
Right.
It's too much for us to handle. I'm a combat vet. I know what it feels like. I've been there. So I can understand it from that experience. But even if I weren't, if I were just willing to sit and listen and not stop a person from telling me about their trauma and not reach out to give them a hug when they're not done yet, and just listen to them tell me about it over and over until they felt like they could let it go, I could do for them what a therapist could do for them.
You just took the words right out of my mouth. My next question to you was going to be, let's just say that there is, you know of someone that is a family member or a friend, someone that you work with, maybe like a coworker or whatever, and you know that they have PTSD and they're experiencing symptoms, they get anxiety. What is the proper way of communicating to them without, stressing them out or giving them anxiety or adding to the problem? But you just basically took that out of the words right out of my mouth, because that was my next question to you.
Couple things to look at there. One is, are they ready to talk about it? Some people may never be, and in order for them to get better, they may need to talk about it. And so if they never are willing to talk about it, they may never get better from it, right? But if your level of rapport with them, if your ability to communicate rises to a point where they feel safe talking to you about anything, and if you are then willing to listen, you don't really have to do anything except listen. Broach the subject and then listen, without judgment, without evaluation, without saying, oh, you can't handle that, nobody can handle that, that sort of thing. Don't say a word, just listen. Don't tell them your judgments about how they should feel or anything like that, because it's not a moral thing. It's not something where you can't make someone feel better with the words you say.
Right.
They have to deal with their emotions and their feelings. It's not something where they hear you say something that's a magic word that makes them feel better. What happens is they start talking to you, their memories and emotions start to resurface, and it may overwhelm them. The biggest mistake you can make at that point is to stop them, right? You tell them, oh, I'm not capable of hearing that, or, this isn't the time or the place, or something like that, and you stop them. What happens is they have trusted you, they're starting to tell you, and you're shutting them down for whatever reason, right? Whatever the reason may be. It may be a valid reason, but in doing that, you re-traumatize them. You make it harder for them to access those feelings the next time. You make it harder for them to trust the next person. Never mind you, who asks them to talk about these things. You need to let them say what is the answer to your question, and it may be much more than you had anticipated. And it may be really hardcore to hear. You know, if someone has never shared these types of things with you before, the first time someone tells you that they were the victim of some violence or saw some violence, it may be really overwhelming for you, especially if you know the other parties involved. So the
Right.
best thing you can do is sit back and listen. And if you're shocked, don't let the shock come to your face. You know, let them talk, hear what they have to say, and then ask them what they think about that. That's sort of a catch-all phrase that works well in therapy, but it can also work well with people. It doesn't have to be phrased as like, so how do you feel about this? You know, it's like, how do you feel now? What's going on now? You know, comparing the present to the past often helps, contrasting the present to the past and comparing it. But really just maybe ask them another time to go through it again, to tell you about anything that they might have missed or anything else they wanted to say about that. Whatever you do, don't shut them down. If the gate is open and they're willing to talk, that means they're ready to start healing, right? Don't
Yeah.
stop them or you're retarded. No, go ahead.
No, I agree with you. And I'm actually looking into the room right now. And well, one of the things I'm actually hearing is I'm echoing. I'm sorry that I'm echoing you guys.
I'm not
Um,
hearing you echo.
you're not hearing echo? That's really interesting. But anyways, Tony Baruch, I'm sorry if I butchered your name. I'm so sorry, sir. It says right here, Tony, you're saying you have to give them space. They feel threat when you guys are trying to get information. Just give them space and time. And that is correct. When people do feel like they can trust, someone and they can talk about their problems and or whatever that's on their mind, whatever that's bothering them, I think it's so important is not to suppress the communication or to shut someone down. I agree with you on that, Tony. Absolutely. I think that's very important that, especially if it's a family member or a close friend, a loved one, husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, if you understand the concept, if you understand what the person that you're dealing with, going through, if they're experiencing anxiety, experiencing PTSD, patience, absolutely, patience is so important, and because the last thing you want to do is to shut someone down. So if you encounter someone that's actually experiencing, PTSD and they're opening up to you to talk about it, absolutely, listening and just not, just like you said, Kevin, also, just listen, just, you don't have to even say anything. They're simply looking to just communicate what's on their mind, what's bothering them, what's going on, and they're just simply, it's like a release for them, and so listening and being patient is also very important. So Kevin, that's very true. It's all about just listening, and just be prepared and just be open to, just listen. That's all it is. It's just listen.
A recommendation I would have is we're in a society where we watch a lot of television. We watch a lot of other people's experiences. And we seem to do very well with watching violence on television.
Mm-hmm.
But if you hear someone recount something that happened to them, a lot of people can't deal with it. So what I would recommend we need a lot more people who are capable of helping people who've been through trauma. In the past, we had shamans, long distant past, priests, stuff like that. And most of them weren't equipped with the skills needed to help a person overcome these sorts of psychological difficulties. But it's not really that complicated or difficult. It's been made very complicated and difficult by people from lots of different backgrounds trying to understand this, what's happening with people, and coming up with lots of different words and ideas to describe it. But what we need is a groundswell of people who can help Jim on the corner, who needs someone to listen to him. You know what I mean? You go to a bar, people are likely to unload on you. You get on a bus and sit next to someone, they're likely to tell you what's happened to them. When I get on an airplane with my training, 6 hours later, the person usually gets up, asks me for my card, thanks me a lot, asks me how much they owe me, that sort of thing, because I've listened to them tell me their life story. People
Right.
don't listen to each other. And I'm not saying we need to become a touchy-feely society where everybody is always looking out for each other's feelings all the time. Well, that would be nice, but I'm not saying that's really necessary. When someone is broken down and they need someone to help them, it's almost a crime that we are not, as individuals, up to that. How can you be a good friend to your friend who's been through something rough if you can't even listen to them when they tell you about it? You know, values have changed a lot. In the early 30s and 40s and 50s, people like to maintain a really great sunny exterior. Everything's fine here. Don't ask me about my troubles. You know what I mean? That was a common value. And the therapy culture is almost revolting to those sorts of values. You know, it's like, keep it inside, deal with it yourself, you don't need any help. That may be true for minor situations and problems. It's also very true if you have a spouse who's a really good listener. You don't need other people to listen to you, you know? Maybe. But the specialized training of listening and drawing a person out on these situations to help them overcome their PTSD, if we all had it, if it was basic, the way you learn, we learn a lot of things in school. How to handle PTSD is something that might take 40 or 50 hours of training to learn. So I know it's taught in 2 weekends in TIR, and it's considered highly effective by mental health professionals and everyone else who uses it. It doesn't require a mental health degree to learn, but to learn how to do these things isn't expensive, it isn't horribly time consuming, and I think it's incumbent upon people so that we don't have to spend $250 an hour sending every veteran who's ever been to combat to a specialist. They don't need a specialist. They need someone who will listen. You know, except in the most severe of cases, just anybody will do. Anybody will do, particularly if they're a good friend or someone you care about, you know. But I think that's an important point to hit on. I'm an activist when it comes to the idea of handling PTSD or trauma. I don't think it should require a specialist. I know it doesn't require a specialist. And our dependence on them has had parents sending their kids to doctors for things they could handle in 45 minutes if they were willing to sit and listen to their child. If they were trained,
Wow.
if they're
Wow,
trained.
I agree.
Yep.
That's
So
incredible. I so agree. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm just like, wow.
I'm not saying it applies to absolutely every mental condition, but
Right.
in the case where there's been a big change or of violence, a person can get trained in what's called critical incident debriefing or stress debriefing, CISD. They can get trained in that in a weekend. They can get trained in traumatic incident reduction in a weekend or two. So in 3 weekends, you can diffuse almost everything that your average person will run into, even your average person who's been a victim of rape or combat. The problems come in where it's complex, where a person has had tons and tons of trauma throughout their life. That person might need to see a specialist. But if we had, we have a nation of 300 million people. If 80 million of us were trained in how to do stress handlings and trauma handling, how many specialists would we need? How much would the healthcare costs for that person be? How many of our veterans would not need to go to prison or have lifelong drug addictions because they couldn't handle their stress from combat or from violent crime or whatever it was, I really think that, there was a giant spike after Vietnam War of Vietnam vets homeless or in prison. They just couldn't readjust to living back in the United States under the pressures of civilian life. They had something else going on in their head, and they needed it handled before they could go back to regular life.
Right.
We never let them do that. Instead, they end up on the street because they can't function in a job. You don't want some guy gibbering off in a corner or going off on your customers. I get it, We need these people to be helped. They become a massive drain on our health resources. So if nothing else than from an economic viewpoint, we should train people in how to be stress handlers, But when it comes to just sympathy and empathy and common human decency, The guys who go off to war, the women who go off to war in our name, if they come back messed up, don't tell me how much you care about them and wave the flag when you are not trained to handle their stress. It's not
Right.
that hard to learn, you know?
I understand.
So learn it. It's not that hard to learn. It's actually fairly simple. And it's becoming more and more well understood that it doesn't require a specialist. So for years and years and years, we depended on psychiatrists and then psychologists and now social workers, but there are never enough of them. And the people who need the help the most can't afford to pay $250 an hour to a psychiatrist. They can't afford to pay $90 an hour to a psychotherapist. And they can't pay $30 an hour to a social worker because they don't have a job. They can't keep a job. Their benefits don't pay them enough to even have a apartment by themselves. You know, never mind the healthcare they need. So instead of this becoming a giant healthcare burden, take it on yourself, learn how to handle stress and trauma, and handle it in the people you know. If we did that, we wouldn't need so many specialists. And I'll leave off on my hammering on that point.
All right, awesome. Kevin, thank you so much. This is such wonderful information, such wonderful knowledge, and thank you so much for sharing your awesome insight. And just real quick, again, I just want you to tell everybody, once again, who you are and what you do. So maybe perhaps people are interested, even just like talking to you or messaging you or in contact with you. Just tell us, all of us that are listening right now, what you do and what your practice is, once again.
All right. First off, my name is Kevin Brady. I have a private practice in North Kingstown, Rhode Island. I practice something called metapsychology, and one of the primary techniques of it is traumatic incident reduction, or TIR. TIR was, I think it was 2012, finally recognized by SAMHSA as being an effective intervention for TIR. There was a lot of resistance for a long time because it's not medically based. Trials were limited at first because until you have their verification as being qualified intervention, you can't do insurance, and so without insurance, you can't develop the amount of statistics that you need to prove that you're a good intervention. So it's kind of like, until you're there, you're not there, and to get there, you need to already be there. So that was the slowdown for a long time. But for a long time, the military has been doing prolonged exposure therapy, which is sort of TIR without some of the important components of it. So you don't get full relief. You do get some relief, and for some people that's enough. But it had a high failure rate and still has a high failure rate. So prolonged exposure therapy by itself is a good way to open a case and get some relief, but it's not a completion. TIR goes for completion. It finds a symptom, tracks it down to the earliest incident you can recall, and reduces the stress and trauma from it so that you can confront it fully and see if there's anything lying behind it. Once that's done, the PTSD label will probably come off. You could go back and get assessed again by a psychotherapist, and they would probably say you no longer qualify for the label of PTSD, right? So what I do is TIR. It's very effective in dealing with trauma. I do it from my home, but I'm willing to do home visits. My background was, I was in the military. I saw a lot of guys get messed up. I wanted to help them. I tried with some, and I was lacking some tools. 2001, I stumbled across TIR, and I started, investigating. In 2005, I did my first workshop. And since that point, I've had a very high success rate. I've only had one guy that I can think of off the top of my head where things weren't progressing well. There were some people who discontinued beforehand, before I thought they should, because they felt so much better, or because they were moving or something like that. But it doesn't, what I'll tell you is I went from being nervous and careful about helping people to really excited to take someone into session and help. Because I went from not being certain I could help to being certain I could help. And that's the big difference. Take the training, get the training, and you'll be certain you can help. And you'll no longer worry about whether you can. You just will do it. And people around you will benefit from it. So my practice is called Clear Objectives. There's much more to it than TIR. There's a lot more things you can do. But without TIR up front to handle the trauma load that a lot of people carry, the other stuff isn't going to be very effective anyway. Like, I wouldn't want people doing a lot of the other exercises that I do with them until they had handled their trauma load.
Right.
So I will put in the links who I am and a link to my website. But that's who I am. That's where I am. I won't put my phone number out on YouTube, but I will link to my site where contacting me is easy. I don't require an appointment. I'm happy to talk to people on the phone. I'm happy to talk to people by chat or email also.
Awesome. Awesome. Kevin, thank you so much for coming on and doing this once again. And thanks to you guys for joining today and for tuning in and listening on PTSD and anxiety. And we thank you guys so much, and we welcome you to come back again on the next video. So we will see you then. Thanks so much, Kevin.
You're welcome.
All
Have
right.
a good